March 14th, 1946, Philadelphia. A narrow brownstone apartment on Rittenhouse Square, 3 floors up. 3 people stood before an open mahogany cabinet, staring at empty shelves where 7 sterling silver teaspoons had rested just 1 month earlier. The eldest among them, Constance Fairweather, held her late aunt's leather-bound inventory ledger, her finger tracing down the meticulous entries. The date of entry, January 18th, 1946, 2 months ago. Aunt Meredith Ashford had died February 11th from a stroke, and right up until the end she'd been sharp as a tack, keeping detailed records of everything stored in the apartment. The spoons were gone. Constance raised her eyes to her husband, Edgar. He stood silent, jaw clenched. Beside them, the deceased's niece, Dorothy Lansdowne, flipped through a worn address book. Dorothy said quietly, showing them a page. They hadn't found the cameo either. Edgar lit a cigarette wordlessly, standing by the window. Outside, March snow fell. Wet, heavy flakes. Philadelphia was waking from winter, but inside Meredith Ashford's apartment hung an atmosphere of abandonment and mystery. Dust on the bookshelves, a stopped clock on the wall, the smell of mothballs and old age. Constance slowly turned the pages of the inventory ledger. The entries began in 1935, when Meredith had retired from her position as a school teacher and decided to organize her household. Every item described in detail: name, quantity, condition, storage location, date of last verification. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 3, underscore, 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 quote, underscore, 4, underscore, 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 quote, underscore, 5, underscore, underscore. Meredith's meticulousness bordered on obsession. She didn't just record items. She categorized them, assigned numbers, drew diagrams of their placement throughout the apartment. At the end of each month, she conducted an inspection and maintained a summary table at the back of the ledger. How many items should be present? How many actually were? What had changed? And in this table, starting in May 1941, appeared notations in red pencil. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 6, underscore, underscore. 1 item in May, another in August, 2 in October, 3 in December, 1 more in January 1942. Then the pattern continued through 1943, 1944, 1945, into early 1946. Constance counted. 23 items over 5 years. Not all at once, 1 or 2 things at intervals of several weeks or months. Methodical. Systematic. Someone had been coming to Meredith's apartment repeatedly, opening cabinets, taking something valuable, and leaving. And the old woman had documented each loss in her ledger but told no one. Why had she stayed silent? Perhaps she didn't want to quarrel with family. Perhaps she hoped she was mistaken. Perhaps she feared no one would believe her, quote, 7. Or perhaps she knew exactly who was taking things and couldn't bring herself to accept it. Look at this. Dorothy showed Constance a page from Meredith's address book. There, between recipes and telephone numbers, was a brief note dated January 15th, 1946, 1 month before her death. Quote, 9, quote. The entry stopped mid-sentence. The next page was blank. Constance read these lines 3 times. Her hands trembled. Quote, 10, quote, quote, 11, quote. Dorothy was crying too. Edgar stubbed out his cigarette. But Constance understood that an address book with an elderly woman's fragmentary thoughts wasn't evidence. The police would need facts, witnesses, physical proof. All they had was an inventory ledger with underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, 4, underscore, underscore, underscore notations, and 1 short, unfinished note where Meredith herself doubted her own suspicions. 3 people stood silent in the dusty apartment where a 79-year-old woman had lived, a woman who'd survived the Great War, the Depression, rationing, and died in her own bed surrounded by attention and care. Especially attentive was her nephew Fletcher Thornhill, a 30-year-old draftsman, the golden boy of the family. Fletcher. The same one who'd practically lived at his aunt's place in recent years, helping with shopping, repairs, cleaning. The same one who had keys to the apartment. Maybe she gave things away? Edgar suggested uncertainly. Constance shook her head. In the inventory ledger were 23 items that weren't where they should be, and each had a precise date of last verification. Meredith Ashford had been thorough. Every month she conducted something like an audit. The last entry was from February 3rd, 8 days before her death. __quote _16___. But much was already gone. Fletcher Thornhill was born June 7, 1915 in Philadelphia, son of a bookkeeper and a piano teacher. Only child. His father, Thornton Lansdowne, worked for Midvale Steel Company. His mother, Beatrice, taught piano lessons from their row house in Germantown. They lived modestly, 3 rooms, shared bathroom on the landing. Father died in 1932 from pneumonia during the worst of the Depression, when Fletcher was 17. The funeral notice came from the county hospital. Beatrice didn't leave her room for a week, then pulled herself together and kept teaching children to play piano for 50 cents an hour. The boy grew up quiet, well-mannered, earned good grades. Neighbors remembered him as a polite child who always said hello first and helped elderly residents carry packages. At school, teachers held him up as an example. Look at Fletcher Thornhill, helps his mother at home, gets excellent marks, doesn't cause trouble. Classmates disliked him for this performative righteousness, called him Mama's boy, but Fletcher paid no attention. He learned early that appearing good mattered more than being good. After graduating high school in 1933, at 18 he enrolled in evening courses at Drexel Institute, studying mechanical drafting. Worked days at a printing shop for $8 a week, studied nights. Lived with his mother in the same Germantown row house, turned over most of his wages. She was proud of him, told neighbors, "My Fletcher's a gem, does everything for his mother, never asks for anything for himself." In 1937, at 22, he completed his certificate and got a position at Baldwin Locomotive Works as a junior draftsman. Salary was $22 weekly, raised to $26 after a year. He worked competently, without complaints, but without particular distinction. Management didn't notice him. Colleagues considered him a mouse. During lunch breaks, everyone played cards and smoked in the yard. Fletcher sat in the corner of the cafeteria with a technical manual and sandwiches from home. An ordinary American life. Nothing remarkable. The kind of person easily lost in a crowd. Average height, 5'8", thin, with soft features and a quiet voice. Always neatly dressed, but unremarkably, gray suit, white shirt, dark tie. Hair combed back, wire-rimmed spectacles. Modest, invisible, harmless. That's how his relatives saw him. Fletcher had many relatives. His father's side, large family, 4 sisters who'd married and had children before the Depression. His mother's side was smaller, but still substantial. Total count reached about 40 people if you included 3rd and 4th cousins. Most lived in Philadelphia, the rest scattered through Pennsylvania, Allentown, Reading, Harrisburg. They gathered for funerals and weddings, sent greeting cards at holidays, occasionally assembled for big family dinners celebrating anniversaries. Typical American family, where everyone knew each other at least generally, remembered who was related how, and periodically asked favors of one another. Fletcher was one of those who never refused help. If someone needed to move furniture, they called Fletcher. If someone had to watch an apartment during repairs, Fletcher showed up with a book and sat all day. If an elderly aunt needed accompaniment to the doctor, Fletcher took a day off work, waited in the clinic, helped fill out forms, walked her home. If a leaky faucet needed fixing, Fletcher arrived with tools. If utility bills needed explaining, Fletcher sat at the table, calculated, showed where each charge came from. What Fletcher understood instinctively was something most people never articulate clearly. The social value of helpfulness exceeds its moral weight. A person who appears to help gains more trust than their actions warrant. Fletcher wasn't kind. Kindness requires empathy, a genuine wish for others' well-being. Fletcher was performatively helpful. He helped because it was profitable. Not immediately in money terms, but in accumulated credit. Every fixed faucet, every carried grocery bag, every hour spent listening to an elderly aunt's stories was an investment. The return came later, in access and trust. He had learned this watching his mother with her piano students. Beatrice adjusted her warmth based on who could pay full rate and who paid reduced. The wealthy children got extra time, patient correction, genuine smiles. The poorer ones got efficient instruction and cool dismissal. Fletcher saw that his mother's kindness was strategic, not spontaneous, and he absorbed the lesson. Authenticity doesn't matter if you can fake sincerity convincingly. By his mid-20s, Fletcher had perfected the helpful nephew persona. It wasn't difficult. Most people don't examine helpfulness critically. They accept it at face value, grateful for the assistance. Fletcher understood that elderly women, especially lonely ones, craved attention more than they needed the actual help he provided. The broken radiator was secondary. The company, the masculine presence, the feeling of being cared about. That's what they valued. Fletcher provided theater, and they paid him with trust. He did this calmly, without theatrical self-sacrifice, as though it was simply proper. Never complained, never demanded thanks, never reminded anyone of favors. Just came, did what was needed, left. Relatives grew accustomed to Fletcher being reliable. __quote _20 __, they told each other, and called him more frequently. The elderly aunts especially loved him. There were many, a generation of women born at the turn of the century who'd lived through the Great War, the Depression, rationing. Most were widows, some had never married at all. Either they had no children or their children had moved to other cities, wrote rarely, visited once a year. Loneliness. That's what united these women. And they chronically lacked male attention and assistance. Fletcher appeared in their lives like a godsend. He'd show up, fix the leaky faucet, change a light bulb, bring groceries from the market. He'd listen to their endless stories about the past, how before the war their family had owned a shop on Market Street, how during the Depression they'd sold the last silver to buy food, how during the war they'd saved ration stamps, how after the war they'd helped rebuild. Fletcher would sit on an old sofa, drink tea from a chipped cup, nod, smile, ask questions. He was an attentive listener. That's rare. They called him, quote, 21 baked pies for him, knitted socks, pressed $1 into his pocket, quote, 22. He'd refuse. They'd insist, quote, 23. And they gave him keys to their apartments, so he could come by if they stepped out to the store or doctor, so he could water their plants in their absence, so he could receive the coal delivery, so he could enter any time if they suddenly fell ill and couldn't open the door. Fletcher never refused keys. He took them, added them to his ring, carried them with him. In his pocket jingled 7, then 8, then 10 keys to other people's apartments. He knew which was which, remembered addresses by heart. And he knew what lay behind each door, because he studied them. Not immediately, not on the first visit. Fletcher operated methodically, patiently. First, he'd earned trust, several months of simply helping, taking nothing, asking no unnecessary questions. He'd become __quote _24 _. Then he'd begin observing, memorizing where things were kept, which cabinets opened easily, which were locked, where documents were kept, where money, where jewelry. Old people usually didn't hide things cleverly. Silver was in the sideboard behind glass doors, gold in jewelry boxes on dressing tables, family heirlooms on high shelves or in trunks, savings bonds in desk drawers, cash in cookie tins. Fletcher noticed everything, remembered everything, and waited. The first theft occurred in May 1941. Fletcher was 26, had been working at Baldwin for 4 years, still living with his mother in Germantown. War was raging in Europe, but America hadn't entered yet. People were nervous, uncertain. Fletcher visited his father's aunt, Cornelia Whitmore, who lived alone in a Kensington row house. She was 79, arthritic, nearly deaf. Fletcher had been helping her for 2 years, shopping, minor repairs, reading her mail aloud because her eyesight was failing. That May afternoon, he came to replace a broken window pane. Cornelia was in the kitchen making tea. Fletcher worked in the front room, installed new glass, cleaned up the shards. Then, while waiting for the putty to dry, he walked to the sideboard. He'd been observing this sideboard for months. Behind the glass doors stood a set of silver serving pieces: creamer, sugar bowl, serving spoon. Sterling. Pre-war. Worth maybe $40 together. Cornelia never used them, just kept them on display. She'd mentioned once that they'd been her mother's, brought from England. Fletcher opened the cabinet quietly. No lock. Took the creamer, the smallest piece, wrapped it in his handkerchief, slipped it into his coat pocket. Closed the cabinet, returned to the window. When Cornelia brought tea, Fletcher was sitting on the chair looking at his work. Quote, 25 __. She thanked him, pressed 50 cents into his hand despite his protests. He took it, refusing would have seemed suspicious, and left. That evening he walked to a pawn shop on South Street, nowhere near his neighborhood or his aunt's. Showed the creamer. The pawnbroker examined it, weighed it, offered $12. Fletcher haggled up to $15. Took the money and left. $15, more than half a week's wages, for 5 minutes of risk. He waited 3 months before returning to Aunt Cornelia's. When he did, in August, he fixed a broken chair leg and took the sugar bowl. Same pawn shop, different owner working that day. $14. In October, he took the serving spoon. $13. By the end of 1941, the silver set was gone. Cornelia never mentioned it. Perhaps she hadn't noticed yet. Perhaps she thought she'd misplaced things. Perhaps she didn't want to suspect anyone. Fletcher had discovered his method. Small items, long intervals between thefts, different pawn shops, never the same place twice in a row. And always from elderly relatives who lived alone, whose memory might be questioned, who wouldn't want to cause family strife by making accusations. Each of Fletcher's victims followed a similar trajectory. First came the meeting, usually at a family gathering where someone mentioned needing help. Fletcher volunteered immediately, establishing himself as the solution to their problem. Then came the cultivation phase, regular visits, building routine, becoming part of their weekly pattern. An elderly woman alone values routine above almost everything else. When your days are identical and mostly empty, the predictable arrival of a helpful nephew becomes something to anticipate. Fletcher understood this. He showed up consistently, same day each week, same time if possible. He brought small gifts, nothing expensive, just thoughtful. A newspaper if the woman had trouble getting to the newsstand, a particular tea she liked, a magazine he'd thought she'd enjoy. These tokens cost pennies but built enormous goodwill. The women began to rely on him. When something broke, they'd wait for Fletcher rather than calling a repairman. When they needed groceries, they'd make a list for Fletcher instead of struggling to the market themselves. He made himself indispensable. And once indispensable, he became invisible. Trusted people fade into the background. You don't watch them carefully. You don't question their movements. You don't notice when they pocket something while you're in the next room. Fletcher's victims shared other characteristics beyond age and loneliness. They were all women who'd lived through decades of thrift, who'd accumulated modest possessions through years of careful saving. They weren't wealthy. Fletcher avoided the wealthy because rich families had lawyers, accountants, and people who noticed irregularities. His victims were middle class or lower middle class, retired teachers, secretaries, shopkeepers' widows. Women who'd worked for 40 years, retired on small pensions, lived in rent-controlled apartments with belongings acquired over lifetimes. Silver wedding gifts from the 1890s, jewelry inherited from mothers and grandmothers, small collections of stamps or coins or commemorative plates. These weren't items the women used daily. They were stored, displayed, kept quote 27 quote or quote 28 quote that rarely came, which meant the women didn't interact with these possessions constantly. A woman might not notice her mother's cameo was missing for weeks or months. She might not remember exactly how many silver spoons she'd once owned. Memory, especially in the elderly, becomes uncertain about details. Was it 7 spoons or 6? I could have sworn it was 7, but maybe I'm misremembering. Fletcher exploited this uncertainty ruthlessly. In December 1941, America entered the war. Fletcher received his draft notice in January 1942. He went to the induction center, passed the physical, but when the doctor examined his eyes, noted severe myopia. Fletcher was classified 4F, unfit for combat service. He'd worn glasses since childhood. Now those thick lenses had saved him from the Pacific or Europe. He returned to Baldwin Locomotive, which had switched to war production. The factory ran 3 shifts, making parts for army tanks. Fletcher was transferred to the night shift, 11 to 7, which paid $32 weekly. More importantly, it gave him daytime freedom to visit relatives. The war years, 1942 through 1945, were Fletcher's most productive period. Everyone was distracted. Men overseas, women working in factories, families worried about ration stamps and war news. Elderly relatives were especially lonely. Their children were fighting or working long hours. Fletcher became indispensable. He'd show up during the day when neighbors were at work, help with tasks, chat, leave. And occasionally take something small. A gold locket from Aunt Loretta in February 1942, sold for $28. A pearl necklace from Cousin Maud in June, $45, his best score yet. An ivory chess set from old Harriet Thornton in September, $22. A silver pocket watch from Aunt Cecilia in November, $18. Fletcher was earning more from theft than from his job. But he was careful. Never spent conspicuously. Never bought new clothes or a car or moved to a better apartment. He gave his mother $12 weekly for household expenses, kept the rest in a bank account at Provident Trust. By mid-1943, he had $2,000 saved, a fortune for a draftsman. His mother noticed nothing. Beatrice Thornhill was 62 in 1943, worn down by years of struggle. She taught fewer piano students now. Families couldn't afford lessons during wartime. Fletcher's $12 weekly kept them afloat. She thought her son was simply thrifty, saving his wages. Quote 30, quote, she told the church ladies. Quote 31, quote. The relatives noticed nothing either. Fletcher was beyond suspicion. He was the helpful nephew, the dutiful son, the quiet young man who fixed things and never asked for anything. When items went missing, the old folks assumed they'd misplaced them or given them away and forgotten. Memory failures, wartime confusion, natural aging. Only one person suspected. Meredith Ashford was Fletcher's father's sister. Born 1867, she was 75 in 1942, the eldest of the family's surviving generation. Never married, no children. She'd taught elementary school for 40 years, retired in 1935 with a small pension, lived alone in a Rittenhouse Square apartment, rent-controlled since the 20s. Sharp-minded, independent, fiercely private. Fletcher began helping her in 1940. She'd fallen and broken her wrist. Her niece Constance was overwhelmed with 3 young children and couldn't visit often. Fletcher volunteered. He'd come twice a week, bring groceries, help with tasks too difficult one-handed. When the wrist healed, he kept visiting. Meredith appreciated the company. She was lonely, though she'd never admit it. Fletcher studied her apartment carefully. Meredith was wealthy by her standards. Decades of careful saving, no dependence, modest needs. She owned family silver, her mother's jewelry, first edition books, some small antiques. And she was organized. That leather inventory ledger, starting in 1935, cataloging everything she owned. Fletcher found the ledger in 1941, when Meredith asked him to fetch a book from her desk. He saw the spine, quote, 32, and his stomach tightened. but he showed no reaction, just got the book she'd wanted and left. Later, he realized the ledger might actually help him. If Meredith kept such detailed records, she'd notice when things went missing. But she'd also second-guess herself. Did I forget to record this? Did I move it? Am I getting confused? The very meticulousness that should have protected her would create self-doubt. The first theft from Meredith was in March 1942. A small sterling picture frame from her bookshelf, worth maybe $8. Fletcher took it while she was napping in the afternoon, sold it on Market Street. When Meredith noticed it missing weeks later, she checked her ledger. The frame was recorded, with its shelf location noted. She searched the apartment. Not there. She made a red notation. Missing, March? She didn't mention it to anyone. Didn't accuse Fletcher. She'd been raised to avoid scandal, to doubt herself before doubting others. And Fletcher, kind, helpful Fletcher, was the last person she'd suspect. In August 1942, Fletcher took a small gold ring, $15. In November, a silver letter opener, $6. Meredith noted each loss. Her ledger's summary table began filling with red marks. But still, she said nothing. Perhaps she hoped she was wrong. Perhaps she feared seeming senile. Perhaps she suspected but couldn't bear the truth. By 1943, the pattern was established. Fletcher visited Meredith every week or two. Most visits he took nothing, couldn't be greedy, couldn't rush. But every few months he'd pocket something small when she was out of the room or not paying attention. Always different pawn shops. Always cash. Always careful. The war ended in August 1945. Men came home. Women left the factories. Philadelphia's streets filled with returned soldiers, war brides, celebration. Fletcher was 30 years old, still living with his mother, still working night shift at Baldwin, which was converting back to peacetime production. Still the quiet bachelor nephew who helped elderly relatives. By late 1945, he had $4,000 in the bank. His mother knew about perhaps 300 of it. Savings from my wages, Fletcher had told her. She was proud. Fletcher's thinking about his future, she said. Maybe he'll buy a little house someday. Fletcher had no intention of buying a house. Money was safety. Money was freedom. Money meant never being desperate the way his mother had been when father died, scrambling for piano students, counting pennies for groceries. Fletcher would never be vulnerable like that. He continued his routine through the fall of 1945. One more item from Meredith in September, a small porcelain figurine, $14. Then, in November, the mother's cameo brooch that Meredith had intended for Constance. Fletcher had seen it in her jewelry box many times, knew it was valuable. Waited until November when Meredith went to visit her sister in Harrisburg for a weekend. Fletcher had keys. He'd check on the apartment while she was away. Came by Saturday afternoon, took the cameo, locked up. Sold it on Monday for $62. His best take ever from Meredith. In January 1946, Fletcher took the 7 silver teaspoons. By then, he'd been stealing from Meredith for nearly 4 years. 23 items total. Maybe $600 over that period. Not huge amounts per item, but it added up. And Meredith had noticed. The inventory ledger showed every loss. That note in her address book, dated January 15th, 1 month before she died, showed she'd finally let herself suspect him. But she still said nothing. The note stopped mid-sentence. Perhaps she couldn't finish the thought. Perhaps she hoped she was wrong. Perhaps she was too ashamed to accuse her own nephew. On February 11th, 1946, Meredith Ashford collapsed in her apartment. The milkman found her the next morning when she didn't take her delivery. Stroke. She died in Pennsylvania hospital that afternoon, never regaining consciousness. Constance was notified, made the funeral arrangements. Simple service. Burial at Laurel Hill Cemetery. The apartment had to be emptied. Constance and her husband Edgar came on March 14th with Dorothy Lansdowne to sort through Meredith's belongings. That's when they found the inventory ledger. That's when they realized things were missing. That's when they found the note about Fletcher. Constance's first reaction was denial. Not Fletcher. Anyone but Fletcher. He'd been so helpful, so devoted to Aunt Meredith. There must be some mistake. But the ledger was clear. 23 items carefully recorded, all marked missing with dates. And all had disappeared after Fletcher had begun visiting regularly. Edgar wanted to call the police immediately. Dorothy urged caution. We need to be sure. Constance just felt sick. This was family. This would tear them apart. They spent the rest of that day going through the apartment, comparing the ledger's contents against what was actually there. Some items couldn't be verified. Things might have been given away, sold legitimately, lost innocently. But the silver, the jewelry, the valuables, these weren't things Meredith would have casually disposed of. And the dates of disappearance lined up with Fletcher's visits. By evening, they had a list of what was definitely missing. The teaspoons, the cameo, 2 gold rings, a silver cigarette case, a pearl brooch, several small antiques. Total value perhaps $300. Not a fortune, but significant. And more importantly, theft from family, from an elderly woman who'd trusted him. That night, Constance couldn't sleep, thinking about the ledger and what it meant. The evidence was clear, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The next morning, Edgar went to the police. The 18th District Station on Race Street spoke to a detective named Horace Kellerman, a gruff man in his 50s, 30 years on the force. Edgar laid out the situation: the inventory ledger, the missing items, the note, Fletcher's access and opportunity. Kellerman listened, made notes. Quote 41, quote 42, quote 43, quote 44. Kellerman sighed. Quote 45, quote 46, quote 47. Edgar said yes. But driving home, he felt the weight of what they'd started. This would destroy the family. Detective Kellerman called Fletcher in for questioning 3 days later, March 18, 1946. Fletcher took a personal day from Baldwin, came to the station wearing his good suit, looking worried and confused. Mr. Thornhill, thanks for coming in. I need to ask you some questions about your aunt, Meredith Ashford. Of course. Poor Aunt Meredith. The stroke was so sudden. The interview lasted 45 minutes. Detective Kellerman was experienced at reading people. He'd conducted thousands of interrogations, knew the signs of deception. Too much eye contact, overly detailed explanations, defensive body language, protests before accusations were fully stated. Fletcher showed none of these signs. He sat calmly, answered questions directly, expressed appropriate grief about his aunt's death and appropriate shock at the suggestion of theft. Can you describe your relationship with Meredith Ashford? Kellerman began. She was my father's sister. I've known her my whole life. She was always kind to me. After my father died in '32, she helped us out, paid some bills, brought food. I've been trying to repay that kindness by helping her in her old age. How often did you visit her? Once or twice a week, usually. Sometimes more if she needed something specific. Did she ever mention things going missing? Fletcher's expression clouded with concern. Kellerman watched him carefully. Fletcher stopped, as if the thought was too absurd to complete. His voice carried just the right note of wounded dignity. Not angry, not defensive, just hurt that anyone would suspect him. Kellerman let silence fill the room. Guilty people fill silence with explanations. Innocent people wait for clarification. Fletcher waited. Quote 61. Quote 62. Quote 63. Quote 64. Fletcher nodded slowly, understanding now. Kellerman had to concede the point. Fletcher said this without hesitation, without the micro-expression of memory that would suggest he was accessing a real experience before denying it. He simply denied. Flat. Final. Kellerman noted this. Fletcher said quietly. Kellerman ended the interview with the usual warnings. Don't leave town, we may have more questions. Fletcher left the station looking appropriately troubled but not frightened. Walking to the trolley stop, he permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd handled that well. But the satisfaction was hollow. He'd been questioned by police. His name was in an investigation file. The protective invisibility he'd carefully maintained for 5 years had cracked. The family would hear about this. People would start watching him. His freedom of movement, his access to elderly relatives' homes, all of that was ending. Fletcher had always known this moment would come eventually. Not through his own mistake, but through accumulated suspicion. You couldn't keep taking things forever without someone noticing patterns. He'd just hoped for more time. Another year or two, maybe $5,000 in total savings before he had to stop. But Meredith and her damned inventory ledger had ended it sooner. Over the next week, Kellerman did legwork, checked pawn shops in a 5-mile radius of Fletcher's home and workplace, showed Fletcher's description. No one recognized him. That didn't mean much. Fletcher could have gone to shops farther away, or the shop owners might not remember one customer among hundreds. Checked Fletcher's employment record at Baldwin. Steady worker, never late, no complaints. Not wealthy, but not struggling. Lived modestly with his mother. Talked to other relatives. All praised Fletcher. Wonderful boy. So helpful. Never asks for anything. No one had any complaints. Talked to Meredith's neighbors. Yes, Fletcher visited regularly. Seemed devoted to his aunt. No, they'd never seen him leave with packages or behave suspiciously. Kellerman requested Fletcher's bank records. Judge denied the warrant. Insufficient probable cause. Quote 74, quote the judge said. Quote 75, quote. By early April, the investigation stalled. Kellerman called Edgar Fairweather. Edgar told Constance. She cried for an hour. Not because they couldn't prove it. She knew now Fletcher was guilty, could feel it in her bones. But because Aunt Meredith had died knowing, suspecting, suffering in silence. And because Fletcher would get away with it. The family fractured. Some believed Fletcher was guilty, some didn't. Most didn't want to take sides. Beatrice, Fletcher's mother, was devastated. She confronted him at home. Fletcher looked at his mother with wounded eyes. Beatrice believed him. Or wanted to. Her son. Her good, responsible son. The boy who'd supported her after Thornton died, who'd never caused her a moment's trouble. She couldn't believe he was a thief. But a seed of doubt was planted. She'd look at Fletcher sometimes and wonder. When he gave her money for expenses, she'd think, where did this come from? When she saw his bank book by accident, over $4,000 saved, she'd think, how did he save so much on a draftsman's salary? She never asked, didn't want to know. Fletcher continued working at Baldwin through 1946, but something had changed. He stopped visiting relatives, made excuses, too busy at work, not feeling well, needed to focus on his mother. The relatives who'd loved him felt confused, hurt. Had they driven him away with false accusations? Or had he withdrawn because he was guilty? The consensus settled into uncomfortable silence. Fletcher avoided family gatherings. At weddings and funerals, he'd appear briefly, speak to no one but his mother, leave early. People would whisper, "There's Fletcher. You know what they say about him and Aunt Meredith." But no one confronted him. By 1947, Fletcher had effectively severed himself from the extended family. He worked, came home, spent weekends with his mother. She was getting frailer, 66 years old, arthritis, failing eyesight. He cared for her dutifully, cooked meals, helped her bathe, read to her when her eyes gave out. In September 1948, Beatrice Thornhill fell ill. Pneumonia. She was hospitalized at Pennsylvania Hospital. Fletcher visited every day after work, sat by her bedside. She was lucid until the end. 3 days before she died, she looked at him and said, "Fletcher, I need to know, did you steal from Aunt Meredith?" Fletcher held her hand. "No, Ma, I promise." She studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded, closed her eyes. "All right, son. I believe you." But her grip on his hand loosened slightly. Fletcher knew she didn't believe him. She'd chosen to believe him because she was dying and couldn't bear the alternative. But in her heart, she knew. Beatrice died September 12, 1948. Small funeral, few attendees. Fletcher stood alone at the graveside. Some relatives came but kept their distance. Afterward, he went home to the empty row house in Germantown, sat in the dark, and realized he was truly alone now. He was 33 years old. No wife, no children, no friends. His family had rejected him. His mother had died doubting him. He had $4,000 in the bank and nothing else. Fletcher kept working at Baldwin, but his performance declined. He'd show up late, leave early, make mistakes in his drafts. In 1950, he was demoted, salary cut, didn't protest. In 1952, he was laid off. The company was downsizing after wartime peak. He found work at a smaller firm, then another, then another. Each job paid less. He started drinking, nothing serious at first, just a beer after work. Then 2 beers, then whiskey. By 1955, he was drinking heavily, burning through his savings. The row house in Germantown went into disrepair. Broken windows, peeling paint, stacks of newspapers. Neighbors complained about the smell. Fletcher stopped answering the door. In 1958, the bank foreclosed. Fletcher moved to a boarding house in Kensington, single room, shared bathroom. He worked odd jobs, janitor, night watchman, delivery driver. Drank away most of his wages. People who'd known him in the 40s wouldn't have recognized him in the 50s. The neat young man with wire-rimmed glasses had become a shabby drunk with yellowed teeth and shaking hands. Still thin, but now gaunt. Still quiet, but now sullen. He never married, never made friends. Lived alone in that boarding house room for 11 years. In 1969, at age 54, Fletcher Thornhill died. Cirrhosis of the liver. The landlady found him dead in bed. Burial in a potter's field. No marker. The boarding house took his few possessions for back rent, some clothes, some books, $37 in cash. Constance Fairweather learned of his death from a notice in the newspaper death listings. One line, no details. She didn't go to the burial. But that evening, she sat in her living room and cried. For the aunts. For his mother. For herself. The thief was dead, but no justice had been served. In the Philadelphia Police Department archive still exists a folder with materials from the investigation. On the last page, in Detective Kellerman's handwriting, guilty, not proven. The story ended there. 8 elderly victims over 9 years, 1 man, and no justice, just emptiness. That same evening, after meeting with Constance, Kellerman sat in his office until late. On the desk before him lay spread papers, a list of 8 deceased relatives with dates of death, addresses, family connections. He was charting relationships, who was related to whom, who lived where, when they died. Cornelia Whitmore died August 1943, age 81, distant relative through father's side. Loretta Drummond died November 1943, age 79, third cousin through mother. Maud Kennicott died March 1944, age 77, fourth cousin. Harriet Thornton died July 1944, age 84, distant aunt. Cecilia Brennan died January 1945, age 76, aunt through father. Agnes Hartwell died September 1945, age 80, distant relative. Vivian Colchester died April 1946, age 78, third cousin. Meredith Ashford died February 1946, age 79, aunt through father. 8 people, not 7 as Constance had mentioned, but 8. Kellerman had found one more, Vivian Colchester. Constance hadn't mentioned her, but checking records revealed Fletcher had been listed as a helper and contact for her too. Average age, 79 years. All single, widowed, or childless. All died of natural causes. Time span, 9 years, 1941 to 1946. Roughly 1 death per year, sometimes 2. And each had contact with Fletcher Thornhill in their final years. Kellerman pulled death records. In Vivian Colchester's file was a note that her estate went to the state. No heirs found. But in the apartment inspection report was a remark. __quote _84 ___. Below that, the beat cop's notation. Likely elderly confusion. Kellerman sat back. Gold coins. Not found. Dismissed as old woman fantasy. What if it wasn't fantasy? He called the 15th District, requested the file on Agnes Hartwell's death. An hour later, they called back. Detective, the Hartwell case was closed in 1945. Natural death, modest estate went to the state, property was cleared. There's a notation that the apartment was sealed after the body was found. Seal was broken once for official inspection, then resealed until estate sale. Were all entry points secured? Windows checked? Pause. Report says front door was sealed. Nothing about windows. Kellerman put down the phone. If Fletcher knew about the coins, if Vivian had shown him where she kept them, he could have returned after her death. Through a window, taken the coins, left. Impossible to prove now. 3 years later, the house likely demolished or sold. No witnesses, no coins. But logic screamed, he took the coins too. Kellerman wrote in his report, strong circumstantial evidence suggests Thornhill systematically stole from elderly relatives over period 1941 to 1946. Estimated minimum 8 victims. Unable to establish definitive proof. Recommend case remain open pending new evidence. But no new evidence came. The case file was stored. Years passed. In 1971, a filing clerk at the 18th District named Margaret Delacroix was reorganizing old case files for archiving. She came across the Thornhill folder by chance. Read through it over her lunch break. 74 pages. Interview transcripts, witness statements, the inventory ledger photocopies. And on the last page, Kellerman's note. __, quote _ 90 __. Margaret read the entire file that evening, then sat in the empty records room, smoking by the open window, thinking about how many such stories lay in these gray folders. Crimes without punishment. Criminals who escaped justice. Victims no one remembered. 8 elderly people. 9 years. 1 man. The next day, Margaret called the Department of Vital Statistics, asked if Fletcher Thornhill was still alive. They checked. __, quote _ 91 __. She hung up and thought, so there was punishment after all. A week later, Margaret transferred the file to the city archives. It sits there still, in a box with hundreds of other 1940s cases. No one reads it. No one remembers the names of 8 people recorded in the investigation materials. But somewhere in Philadelphia, at Laurel Hill Cemetery, are graves. Small headstones. Quote 92, quote. Quote 93, quote. Quote 94, quote. And in the Potter's Field section of Holy Cross Cemetery, an unmarked plot. Fletcher Thornhill, 1915 to 1969. No stone, no name, just grass growing over where they buried him. The nephew who stole from family, who died alone, who was punished not by law but by life. And his mother Beatrice, who lies in Germantown Cemetery under a modest stone. Beatrice Thornhill, 1881 to 1948. Beloved teacher and mother. She never knew the full truth. Or maybe she did and couldn't face it. The investigation produced no chargeable evidence, but its social consequences were severe. By mid-April 1946, most of Fletcher's extended family had heard some version of the story. Opinions fractured immediately. Constance became the family's prosecutor, convinced of Fletcher's guilt, insisting others see the pattern. She wrote letters to relatives detailing the evidence, practically begging them to acknowledge what seemed obvious to her. Some agreed. Others thought she was letting grief and suspicion cloud her judgment. Edgar wanted to drop it. "We can't prove anything," he told Constance. "All we're doing is tearing the family apart." But Constance couldn't let it go. Justice wasn't just about criminal conviction. It was about truth being acknowledged, about family knowing who Fletcher really was. Dorothy Lansdowne tried to mediate, suggesting compromise. "Maybe we can't prove he stole, but we can agree to keep him away from other elderly relatives, prevent future problems without requiring admission of past ones." This practical solution satisfied nobody. Beatrice Thornhill defended her son with fierce maternal loyalty. She attended family gatherings specifically to challenge anyone who repeated the accusations. "My Fletcher is a good boy," she'd announce to anyone who'd listen. "He's been slandered by people who don't appreciate his help. Constance is jealous because Fletcher was closer to Meredith than she was." This last accusation was particularly cruel and entirely false, but Beatrice believed it. Fletcher himself stopped attending family events. When asked about it, he told his mother, "I can't be around people who think I'm a thief. It's too painful." He presented himself as the wronged party, the helpful nephew whose kindness had been repaid with suspicion. Some relatives accepted this narrative. Others saw it as manipulation. The family split roughly in half. Cousins who'd been close stopped speaking. Siblings took opposite sides. Holiday gatherings shrank as people chose which invitation to accept based on who else would be there. The Thornhill-Lansdowne-Fairweather family, which had maintained cohesion through depression and war, fractured over unprovable accusations of theft. This rupture was Fletcher's real legacy. Not the physical items he'd stolen, those were replaceable, monetarily modest, but the trust he'd destroyed, the relationships he'd poisoned, the family structure he'd shattered. These losses were permanent. Even after everyone involved died, the family remained divided. Grandchildren of the original antagonists grew up hearing different versions of events, absorbing inherited positions on whether Fletcher had been guilty or wrongly accused. The story closed, the files archived, the graves unmarked or forgotten, and the only people who remembered were those who'd been damaged by it, the relatives who'd discovered the thefts, who'd argued about whether to believe or doubt, who'd torn their family apart over one man's greed. Constance Fairweather lived until 1978. She never spoke about Fletcher Thornhill after 1950, but she kept her aunt's inventory ledger in a desk drawer. Sometimes she'd take it out, read the meticulous entries, see the red marks for missing items, and remember the woman who documented her own victimization in silence because she couldn't bear to accuse family. Dorothy Lansdowne lived until 1982. She named her daughter Meredith after the aunt who died alone with her suspicions. The girl never knew why she'd been given that name. Edgar Fairweather lived until 1971. He'd been the one who insisted on going to the police, who'd pushed for investigation. After it fell apart, he never forgave himself for not being able to prove what he knew was true. In his final years, he'd tell his grandchildren, "Sometimes you know something with absolute certainty, but knowing isn't enough. The world requires proof." As for Fletcher Thornhill, his name disappeared from family memory within a generation. By the 1970s, younger relatives had no idea who he was. The story was too shameful to pass down. Better to forget. Better to pretend it never happened. But in that police archive, the folder remains, evidence of a man who stole from family, who betrayed trust, who took advantage of elderly people's loneliness and need, who got away with it legally but paid another price. And on the last page of the file, still visible, Kellerman's final entry. There are different kinds of punishment. The law is only one. Time is another. Guilt is a third. Fletcher Thornhill will carry what he did for the rest of his life, whether he admits it or not. That's not justice, but it's something. Kellerman himself died in 1967, 2 years before Fletcher. He never knew whether his prediction was right, never knew whether Fletcher felt guilty, never knew whether there was any real punishment at all. But the file remains. The evidence remains. The truth remains, even if unprovable. And sometimes, in the archives, that has to be enough. The story of Fletcher Thornhill ended not with a dramatic courtroom scene or confession, but with slow dissolution of a life, a family, a reputation. He'd stolen perhaps $2,000 over 9 years, taken it from people who trusted him, people who loved him. He'd lived with that knowledge for 23 years after the investigation ended, drinking himself to death in a boarding house room. Was that punishment? Was that justice? Or was it simply the inevitable outcome of a life built on betrayal and maintained by deception? No one can answer that. The dead keep their secrets. Fletcher never confessed. His victims never got restitution. Their families never got closure. The law never convicted anyone. Just 8 elderly people who died naturally, 1 man who died drunk, and a filing cabinet full of paper that proves nothing, except that sometimes the worst crimes go unpunished. And in Philadelphia, on certain autumn evenings when the light slants through the old row houses of Germantown and Rittenhouse Square, you can almost imagine those elderly people sitting by their windows, waiting for a helpful young man to arrive with groceries and a smile. Waiting to trust someone who would betray them. Waiting for the next item to vanish from the cabinet after he left. History doesn't record the small thefts, the missing teaspoons, the vanished cameos, the disappeared coins. It records wars and presidents and great movements of people. But the real texture of life is in these smaller betrayals, these intimate crimes, these family secrets that get buried and forgotten. Fletcher Thornhill's story is one of thousands that played out in American cities in the 1940s and 50s. The helpful nephew, the lonely aunt, the missing valuables, the accusations that couldn't be proved, the families torn apart, the criminals who died unpunished by law but destroyed by their own choices. This is not a story with a moral. There's no lesson here except perhaps this: trust is fragile. Family is complicated, and sometimes the people who seem most helpful are hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes, knowing the truth isn't enough. Sometimes you can be absolutely certain of something and still be powerless to prove it, or fix it, or get justice for it. That's what Meredith Ashford learned in her final year. She kept her inventory ledger, made her red marks, wrote her fragmentary note. She knew. But knowing didn't save her valuables, or spare her family the pain, or bring Fletcher to justice. It just meant she died with the burden of knowledge, unable to act on it. And that might be the saddest part of this whole story. Not the thefts themselves, but the silence that surrounded them. The old woman who suspected but couldn't speak. The family who discovered the truth too late. The police who believed but couldn't prove. The thief who got away with it and spent the rest of his life running from what he'd done. In the end, Fletcher Thornhill stole things worth perhaps $2,000. But the real cost was much higher. Trust destroyed, family fractured, lives shadowed by doubt and shame. A mother who died wondering if her son was a thief. Relatives who spent decades divided over whether to believe or defend. And 8 elderly people, Cornelia, Loretta, Maud, Harriet, Cecilia, Agnes, Vivian, Meredith, who deserved better than to have their kindness exploited, their possessions stolen, their final years marred by the gradual realization that someone they loved was betraying them. They're all dead now. The victims, the thief, the investigators, the family members who fought over what to believe. All buried in Philadelphia cemeteries, their stories forgotten, except for this file in the archives. But maybe that's enough. Maybe someone finding this file decades from now will read it and remember. Will think about those 8 people, We'll consider the nature of family crime and unpunished guilt. We'll recognize that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms, that punishment takes many forms, that sometimes the only judgment that matters is the one you carry inside yourself. Fletcher Thornhill carried his judgment for 23 years. Whether it was enough is not for us to say. The dead don't answer questions. They just lie in their graves and wait for memory to fade. And eventually, it does. The graves weather. The markers erode. The names become unreadable. The stories disappear. And all that's left is a file in an archive, gathering dust, waiting for someone to stumble across it and wonder, who were these people? What really happened? And did anyone ever pay for what they did? The answer is, maybe. In their own way. Over time. Through slow dissolution and lonely death and the weight of carrying secrets that destroyed them from inside. That's not the justice we want, but sometimes it's the only justice we get. And with that, the story of Fletcher Thornhill, the helpful nephew who stole from family, comes to its end. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. Not with conviction, but with slow decay. Not with answers, but with questions that will never be fully resolved. The file closes. The archive darkens. The story ends. And somewhere in Philadelphia, the spring of 1946 fades into memory, leaving only shadows and silence and the persistent question, what really happened in those quiet apartments when the helpful young man with the wire-rimmed glasses and the soft voice visited his elderly relatives? We know. The evidence knows. The truth knows. But the law never did. And maybe that's the point of this whole story. That sometimes the worst crimes are the ones that never get prosecuted, the ones that hide inside families, the ones that destroy trust and relationships and leave nothing but doubt and pain in their wake. Fletcher Thornhill got away with theft, but he didn't get away with living afterward. And perhaps that's all the justice this story offers. The cold comfort of knowing that even unpunished crimes exact their price, that even successful criminals pay in the end, that time and guilt and loneliness are their own forms of punishment. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's what we have. The story ends here. The file closes, the past recedes, and Fletcher Thornhill becomes just another name in the archives, just another forgotten Philadelphia nobody who lived badly and died alone and left behind nothing but pain and a folder full of unprovable accusations. That's how most stories end. Not with clarity, but with ambiguity. Not with justice, but with time running out. Not with resolution, but with everyone involved dying and taking their truths to the grave. And so, we close the ledger on Fletcher Thornhill, thief, nephew, son. Born 1915, died 1969, guilty of crimes he was never convicted of. Punished by life if not by law. Remembered by no one except the families he damaged and the detectives who couldn't prove what they knew. May he rest in his unmarked grave. And may the 8 people he stole from rest easier knowing that someone, somewhere, still remembers what happened and still cares that justice was never served.